The morning of June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Michael Kurowski of the 2nd Engineer Special Brigade crouched in the blood-tinged surf, watching the concrete aperture of Weaponized Nest 62 spit tracers across the beach. Around him, infantrymen from the 29th Division hugged the shingle, pinned down by interlocking fields of fire from pillboxes that German engineers had spent 4 years perfecting. The reinforced concrete walls measured 8 feet thick at their facings. American naval gunfire had done nothing but chip the surfaces. Kurowski carried a Bangalore Torpedo, 5 sections of galvanized steel pipe, each 5 feet long, packed with 8 pounds of Composition C explosive. Total weight, 55 pounds. The weapon had been designed in Bangalore, India, in 1897 for clearing barbed wire entanglements. Now, on this beach, engineers were improvising, uses its inventors had never imagined. The question facing Kurowski was not whether the Bangalore could breach the pillbox. The question was whether he could assemble the sections under fire, position them against the embrasure, light the fuse, and survive the attempt. Around him, dozens of engineers were attempting the same calculation with the same equipment against similar fortifications. By nightfall, the answer to a larger question would emerge. Could a weapon designed for wire obstacles in colonial India penetrate the most sophisticated defensive architecture the Third Reich had created? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The irony was profound. German military engineers had invested enormous resources in creating what they called the Atlantic Wall. Thousands of reinforced concrete structures protected by steel doors, interlocking fields of fire, and carefully calculated angles of approach. American military planners had studied these fortifications for months, analyzing reconnaissance photographs and interviewing French resistance members who had watched their construction. The conclusion had been sobering. Standard infantry weapons would prove inadequate. Yet the primary tool American engineers brought to Omaha Beach that morning was essentially unchanged from a design created nearly half a century earlier for an entirely different purpose. The Bangalore Torpedo had seen limited use in World War I for wire cutting. Its adoption for the Normandy invasion represented not advanced military technology, but desperate improvisation. Engineers had recognized that the weapon's focused explosive force, originally intended to snap barbed wire, might prove effective against fortification apertures if positioned correctly. The concrete pillboxes of Weaponized Nest 62 represented the culmination of German defensive engineering. Construction had begun in 1942 under the direction of the organization TOT, the Third Reich's military engineering corps. Each structure had been designed according to specifications that accounted for every known American explosive capability. The walls incorporated steel reinforcement bars spaced at precise intervals. The concrete mixture used aggregate carefully selected for maximum compressive strength. Embrasures were designed with angular approaches that prevented direct fire from reaching the interior. These fortifications embodied a philosophy that sufficient concrete, properly reinforced and intelligently positioned, could resist any assault. German engineers had calculated the blast resistance of their structures against known American demolition charges. They had tested concrete samples against various explosive types. They had designed door mechanisms that could withstand near misses from naval shells. What they had not anticipated was how American engineers would adapt obsolete equipment for purposes its designers never intended. The Bangalore Torpedo existed because of a problem that had nothing to do with concrete. In 1897, British colonial forces in India faced extensive barbed wire obstacles during frontier conflicts. Captain R.L. McClintock of the Royal Engineers developed a solution. Lengths of pipe filled with explosives that could be pushed through wire entanglements and detonated, creating gaps for infantry advance. The design was elegant in its simplicity. Each section consisted of a 2-inch diameter steel tube, 5 feet long, threaded at both ends to allow multiple sections to be screwed together. The explosive filler was black powder initially, later replaced by more stable compounds. The weapon saw limited use in World War I, primarily on the Western Front, where wire obstacles had proliferated beyond anything 19th-century military planners had imagined. Engineers would assemble multiple sections, push the assembly through wire barriers under cover of darkness, attach a fuse, and detonate. The blast would snap the wire across a width of several yards, creating a lane for assault troops. The method was dangerous. Engineers working in no man's land faced machine gun fire, artillery, and the ever-present risk of premature detonation. By 1939, when war returned to Europe, the Bangalore Torpedo had become a standard item in military engineer inventories, but its role remained narrowly defined. American Army engineers trained with the weapon primarily for wire-cutting operations. The technical manual 3-240, published in 1940, devoted 3 pages to Bangalore Torpedo employment. Every paragraph addressed wire obstacles. Not one mentioned fortifications. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The manual specified assembly procedures, safety distances, and detonation methods. Engineers learned to screw sections together in the dark by feel. They practiced pushing assembled torpedoes through simulated wire barriers. They calculated how many sections would be needed to reach through obstacles of various depths. The training was thorough for its intended purpose. It was utterly inadequate for what engineers would face in Normandy. Meanwhile, German military engineering had evolved along an entirely different trajectory. The experience of World War I had convinced German planners that linear trench systems were obsolete. The new defensive philosophy emphasized strongpoints, mutually supporting fortifications constructed of reinforced concrete, each designed to survive direct hits from artillery while maintaining fields of fire that covered neighboring positions. The organization TOT began implementing this philosophy across occupied Europe in 1940. The Atlantic Wall represented the most ambitious fortification project since the Maginot Line. Along the French coast, from the Spanish border to Belgium, German engineers constructed thousands of concrete structures. The designs varied by location and strategic importance, but certain principles remained constant. Wall thickness at embrasures never fell below 6 feet. Concrete mixtures incorporated high-grade cement and carefully graded aggregate. Steel reinforcement followed specifications that accounted for blast loads from the largest Allied naval guns. At sites identified as probable invasion beaches, fortifications received additional attention. Omaha Beach hosted 15 major strongpoints designated Widerstandsnest numbers 60 through 74. Each contained multiple pillboxes, ammunition storage bunkers, personnel shelters, and observation posts. The pillboxes themselves came in standardized designs: Tobruk's for light weapons, Regelbaus for heavier guns, specialized structures for mortars and anti-tank guns. Construction quality was exceptional. German engineers used wooden forms precisely shaped to create the desired wall angles. They poured concrete in layers, allowing each to cure properly before adding the next. They installed waterproofing membranes and drainage systems to prevent deterioration. American military intelligence had been analyzing Atlantic Wall fortifications since 1942. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the coast repeatedly, documenting every visible structure. The photographs revealed disturbing information. The fortifications were far more extensive than initial estimates suggested, and they appeared to be built to withstand considerable punishment. Analysts measured wall shadows in photographs to estimate thickness. They identified embrasure positions and calculated fields of fire. They noted the careful positioning of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, concrete tetrahedrons designed to destroy landing craft before troops could reach the beach. The question facing invasion planners was straightforward. How do you reduce fortifications of this quality with the tools available? Naval gunfire would provide preliminary bombardment, but accuracy from ships offshore remained problematic. Aerial bombing could crater the area, but rarely achieved direct hits on small, hardened targets. Infantry weapons were inadequate against concrete. The responsibility would fall to combat engineers carrying demolitions. American engineer doctrine in 1943 emphasized mobility and improvisation. Engineers were expected to clear obstacles, bridge water barriers, remove mines, and eliminate fortifications using whatever means proved effective. The Engineer Field Manual 5-20, revised in 1943, devoted chapters to demolition techniques, most focused on timber bridges, steel structures, and earthwork obstacles. The section on concrete demolitions was brief, acknowledging that breaching reinforced concrete required considerable explosive charges properly placed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Training for Normandy reflected these realities. Engineer special brigades formed specifically for the invasion conducted rehearsals on English beaches that approximated Norman terrain. They practiced demolition techniques against concrete mock-ups built to intelligence estimates of German fortification strength. The mock-ups were never as substantial as the actual pillboxes would prove to be. Engineers experimented with various explosive charges. Satchel charges containing blocks of TNT or composition C, pole charges that could be pushed against fortification walls, and Bangalore torpedoes for wire obstacles. The Bangalore's potential against concrete emerged almost accidentally during these rehearsals. An engineer unit experimenting with various demolition methods attempted inserting a Bangalore torpedo through the embrasure of a practice pillbox. The shaped charge effect created by the pipe concentration proved more effective than scattered satchel charges against the embrasure interior. The technique was noted, discussed, and incorporated into training, but it remained secondary to the weapon's primary wire-cutting role. What American planners understood imperfectly was the psychological dimension of the fortification problem. German defenders had been trained to believe their concrete structures were nearly impregnable. Propaganda within Wehrmacht units emphasized Atlantic wall strength. Soldiers manning the fortifications had spent months, sometimes years, watching their positions grow stronger. They had witnessed naval bombardment exercises where shells struck near their bunkers without penetrating. They had been told repeatedly that no invasion could succeed against properly manned fortifications. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. The fortifications were indeed formidable, but confidence bred predictability. German defenders expected attacks to come from certain directions using certain methods. They anticipated naval gunfire, aerial bombing, and infantry assault. They had prepared for these contingencies. What they had not prepared for was the American capacity for improvisation, the willingness of individual engineers to adapt equipment designed for one purpose to an entirely different problem, under fire, with their survival depending on whether the improvisation succeeded. The Bangalore Torpedo that Staff Sergeant Kurowski carried onto Omaha Beach consisted of 10-foot sections when fully assembled. Each individual section weighed 11 pounds empty, 19 pounds when loaded with explosive. The standard configuration used 5 sections, creating a 50-foot assembly, though engineers could add or remove sections based on the obstacle they faced. The explosive filling was composition C, a plastic explosive composed of RDX, plasticizer, and stabilizers. Each section contained exactly 8 pounds of this material, giving a 5-section torpedo 40 pounds of high explosive. The sections connected through a screw-thread coupling at each end. In theory, an engineer could assemble multiple sections quickly by hand. In practice, the threads often jammed with sand, mud, or corrosion. Engineers learned to carry light oil to lubricate the threads and pliers to force reluctant sections together. The assembly process required both hands, making it impossible to carry a weapon while connecting sections. This meant engineers assembling Bangalores under fire were completely vulnerable during the most critical moments of their work. The detonation system used a standard M60 fuse lighter attached to a length of time fuse. The fuse burned at a rate of approximately 40 seconds per foot. Standard practice called for using a 2-foot length, giving the engineer 80 seconds to reach cover after lighting. In training, this seemed adequate. On an open beach, under machine gun fire, 80 seconds became an eternity. Some engineers cut their fuses shorter, accepting greater risk of injury to reduce their exposure time. Others used longer fuses and prayed that German gunners would not spot the burning fuse and concentrate fire on the torpedo's position. The 2nd Engineer Special Brigade had trained specifically for the Normandy assault. Formed in 1943, the unit comprised 16 engineer combat battalions organized into 4 regiments. Each battalion contained approximately 600 men divided into companies of roughly 140 personnel each. These were not ordinary combat engineers. Selection emphasized physical fitness, technical aptitude, and psychological resilience. Training lasted 16 weeks, far longer than standard engineer courses. The curriculum covered beach obstacle removal, mine clearance, demolition techniques, and amphibious operations. Engineers practiced working in surf conditions, learned to identify German mine types by touch in darkness, and rehearsed demolition procedures until they could perform them reflexively. The Bangalore Torpedo received particular attention. Each engineer assembled and disassembled the weapon repeatedly until the threading process became automatic. They practiced pushing assembled torpedoes through wire obstacles while crawling. They learned to estimate distances by counting sections, calculating that each 5-foot section advanced the torpedo's nose by approximately 4.5 feet after accounting for overlap at the couplings. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What training could not replicate was the sensory overload of combat. The sound of machine gun fire changes calculation. The sight of wounded men alters decision-making. The smell of explosives and blood affects concentration. Engineers who had performed flawlessly during rehearsals found themselves struggling with simple tasks when bullets struck the sand around them. Those who succeeded on Omaha Beach did so not because their training was perfect, but because they maintained enough presence of mind to apply imperfect training under impossible conditions. The German fortifications these engineers faced represented years of development. The standard pillbox design designated Regelbau 680 employed walls measuring 2 meters thick at the front face, tapering to 1.5 meters at the rear. The concrete mixture used Type 330 cement, a high-strength formulation that achieved compressive strength of 4,000 pounds per square inch after 28 days of curing. Aggregate consisted of crushed stone graded from 3/4 inch down to fine sand, mixed in proportions that maximized density while maintaining workability during pouring. Steel reinforcement followed specifications that accounted for both compressive loads from the concrete's weight and tensile stresses from blast effects. Vertical bars ran every 12 inches through the walls, with horizontal bars at the same spacing. At embrasures, where stress concentration was highest, reinforcement doubled. The bars themselves were high-carbon steel, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with surface deformations that improved concrete bonding. German engineers had calculated that this reinforcement pattern would prevent catastrophic failure, even if the concrete cracked under blast loads. The embrasures presented the most vulnerable point in these structures, and German engineers had designed them carefully. The opening measured approximately 18 inches wide at the exterior face, expanding to 36 inches at the interior to allow weapon traverse. The walls around the embrasure were thickest, sometimes exceeding 3 meters. The angle of approach was calculated to prevent direct fire from reaching the interior unless the attacking weapon was positioned almost perfectly aligned with the opening's center axis. The assault on Widerstandsnest 62 began at 0630 hours, 30 minutes after the first wave touched the beach. By that point, Omaha Beach had become what veterans would later call a killing ground. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men crawled toward any cover they could find. The carefully planned timetable had collapsed within minutes of the first landing craft dropping their ramps. Naval gunfire had failed to suppress the fortifications. Aerial bombing had missed the strong points entirely, cratering empty fields hundreds of yards inland. Staff Sergeant Kurowski's section had lost 3 men crossing the beach. 2 were wounded by machine gun fire. 1 had simply disappeared in an artillery blast that left a crater where he had been crawling. The remaining 5 engineers reached the shingle embankment at the high tide line, where a slight elevation provided minimal protection from direct fire. Above them, Perhaps 80 yards up the bluff, the pillbox continued firing. Kurovsky could see the muzzle flashes from the embrasure. He could hear the MG-42's distinctive sound, a rate of fire so rapid it sounded like tearing cloth rather than individual shots. The original plan called for engineers to approach fortifications under covering fire from infantry. There was no covering fire. The infantry was pinned down or dead. The revised plan called for using satchel charges against fortification doors. The doors were inaccessible, protected by interlocking fire from adjacent pillboxes. What remained was improvisation. Kurovsky had a Bangalore Torpedo and an idea that might work if he could reach the pillbox embrasure. He assembled the torpedo sections while lying in the shingle. 5 sections, screwed together with hands that shook despite his attempts at steadiness. The threads caught on sand. He cleared them, applied oil from a small can he carried, tried again. The sections connected. 25 feet of steel pipe packed with 40 pounds of explosive. He attached the fuse lighter to the end section, inserted a 3-foot length of time fuse. 3 feet meant 2 minutes. Enough time to position the torpedo and reach cover, assuming nothing went wrong. The approach required crawling up the bluff face, carrying a 55-pound steel pipe that wanted to catch on every obstacle. Kurovsky pushed the torpedo ahead of him, advancing in short rushes between bursts of machine gun fire. The German gunner was firing at targets across the beach, not noticing the single engineer crawling up the bluff below his position. 30 yards, 20 yards. The embrasure was directly above, perhaps 10 yards further up the slope. At 15 yards, Kurovsky could see the machine gun barrel protruding from the embrasure. He could see spent cartridge casings tumbling out to bounce down the concrete face. He positioned the Bangalore Torpedo nose directly in line with the embrasure opening, adjusting the angle to account for the slope. The torpedo had to enter the embrasure horizontally, or it would simply scrape along the concrete face. He made the final adjustment, pulled the fuse lighter, heard the distinctive pop as the friction igniter lit the time fuse. He scrambled backward, sliding down the bluff face, tumbling into the shingle, pressing himself against the embankment. The fuse burned with a thin trail of smoke. Someone in the pillbox must have seen it. The machine gun fire stopped. There was shouting in German. Then the Bangalore detonated. The explosion was not what Kurovsky expected. Rather than a single blast, it seemed to come in stages. The initial detonation sent a shockwave that he felt in his chest. Then came secondary explosions from inside the pillbox, probably ammunition cooking off. Smoke poured from the embrasure. The machine gun fire did not resume. Kurovsky did not know that the Bangalore Torpedo had functioned exactly as Composition C's designers intended. The explosive, confined within the steel pipe, had generated a focused blast wave that travelled down the pipe's length and emerged through the embrasure at high velocity. The wave had struck the machine gun crew directly, killing them instantly. It had ignited ammunition stored near the embrasure. The blast pressure inside the confined space had been catastrophic for anyone inside. What Kurovsky did know was that the pillbox had stopped firing. Other engineers had seen the explosion. Within minutes, 3 more Bangalore Torpedoes were being assembled and positioned against other embrasures along the strongpoint. By 0700 hours, 4 of the 6 pillboxes in Weaponized Nest 62 had been neutralized using a weapon that had been designed for cutting wire in India 47 years earlier. The success at Weaponized Nest 62 was not isolated. Along Omaha Beach's 5,000 yards, engineer teams were discovering independently that Bangalore Torpedoes could accomplish what satchel charges and pole charges could not. The weapon's effectiveness came from characteristics its designers had never considered relevant to fortification assault. The steel pipe concentrated the blast wave rather than allowing it to dissipate spherically. The pipe's rigidity allowed engineers to position the charge precisely at the embrasure opening despite working under fire. The sectional design meant engineers could adjust the weapon's length to match the specific tactical situation. By mid-morning, reports were reaching brigade headquarters that Bangalore Torpedoes were proving unexpectedly effective against pillbox embrasures. These were not formal after-action reports, but hasty messages passed through whatever communication channels remained functional. A radio operator would report that Company B had knocked out a pillbox using Bangalore's. A runner would arrive at battalion headquarters with word that engineers had cleared a strong point using the wire-cutting weapon against concrete fortifications. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, commanding the 2nd Ranger Battalion at Point du Hoc, received similar information. Rangers assaulting the fortified observation post had brought Bangalore Torpedoes primarily for clearing wire obstacles expected at the cliff top. They found the wire obstacles less extensive than anticipated, but discovered that German personnel shelters built into the cliff face had embrasures vulnerable to the same technique engineers were using on the beach. Rangers assembled Bangalore's, positioned them against the concrete embrasures, and achieved the same results their engineer counterparts were discovering simultaneously 3 miles east. The afternoon brought a development no one had anticipated. German forces, recognizing that their pillbox embrasures had become critical vulnerabilities, began attempting to block them from inside. Defenders stacked ammunition boxes, furniture, and sandbags behind embrasure openings, trying to create barriers that would absorb or deflect the Bangalore Torpedo's blast. The improvised barriers proved inadequate. The blast wave from 40 pounds of composition C in a confined pipe simply blew through the obstacles, though it sometimes reduced the blast's lethality against personnel deeper inside the fortification. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By evening, when the first coherent tactical assessments could be compiled, engineer officers were reporting that Bangalore Torpedoes had proven instrumental in reducing fortifications at multiple strongpoints. The weapon had not been the only factor in the beach's eventual clearance. Naval gunfire, infantry assault, tank support where available, and sheer determination had all contributed. But the Bangalore had provided a capability that filled a critical gap, a means for individual engineer teams to neutralize concrete pillboxes when other support was unavailable. The irony was profound and multi-layered. German engineers had spent years designing fortifications to resist known American demolition capabilities. They had tested concrete samples against explosive charges. They had calculated blast resistance using engineering principles developed over decades. They had created structures that successfully resisted the weapons they expected to face. What defeated them was a weapon they had not considered relevant, used in a manner its designers had never intended, by soldiers improvising under desperate conditions. American engineers had brought a 19th-century weapon to assault 20th-century fortifications and discovered that sometimes old solutions work against new problems if applied creatively. The Bangalore Torpedo's effectiveness came not from superior explosive power, but from tactical characteristics that happened to match the specific vulnerabilities of pillbox embrasures. The steel pipe concentrated the blast. The sectional design allowed precise positioning. The weapon's length permitted engineers to attack from angles that fortification designers had not adequately protected. More significantly, the success demonstrated something about military effectiveness that formal doctrine had not captured. The American military's emphasis on improvisation, on allowing junior leaders to adapt equipment to circumstances, had proven more valuable than the German emphasis on engineering perfection. The Atlantic Wall fortifications were indeed nearly impregnable when attacked according to the methods their designers anticipated. They were vulnerable when attacked using methods that no formal doctrine had prescribed, by soldiers who recognized problems, identified available tools, and created solutions in real time under fire. The days following June 6th brought a systematic reassessment of engineer demolition doctrine. By June 8th, the 1st Engineer Special Brigade had compiled preliminary after-action reports from units that had landed at Omaha Beach. The reports documented 53 separate instances where engineer teams had used Bangalore Torpedoes against pillbox embrasures with confirmed success. Additional instances remained unconfirmed because the chaotic nature of the assault made detailed record-keeping impossible during the critical hours. Staff Sergeant Kurowski survived the Normandy campaign. He was wounded by mortar fire near St. Lo on July 18th and evacuated to England. His unit citation, filed in August 1944, specifically mentioned his initiative in employing the Bangalore Torpedo against the pillbox at Widerstandsnest 62. The citation noted that his action had enabled infantry advance and likely saved numerous lives by eliminating a position that commanded a significant section of the beach. Kurowski received the Silver Star. He would later say that the medal recognized luck as much as skill, that dozens of other engineers had done the same thing that morning, and that many had not survived to receive recognition. The 2nd Engineer Special Brigade suffered casualties approaching 30% during the initial assault. Of the 1,600 engineers who landed in the first waves, approximately 480 were killed or wounded before the beach was secured. The casualty rate among engineer teams conducting demolition operations was higher still, approaching 40% in some companies. These losses reflected the fundamental danger of their mission, approaching fortified positions under fire while carrying explosives. The Bangalore Torpedoes' tactical success came at this human cost. The weapon proved effective, but using it required engineers to expose themselves while assembling sections, crawling within yards of enemy positions, positioning the assembled torpedo precisely, and then withdrawing before detonation. German defenders learned quickly to watch for engineers carrying the distinctive pipe sections. Machine gun fire would concentrate on any soldier attempting to assemble a Bangalore. Several engineers were killed when enemy fire detonated their explosives prematurely. Despite these costs, engineer units throughout the European theatre rapidly adopted the anti-pillbox technique. By late June, training protocols at engineer schools in England incorporated lessons from Omaha Beach. New engineers arriving as replacements received instruction specifically on using Bangalores against fortification embrasures. The technique spread through informal channels as well. Veterans rotated to training duties would demonstrate the method to new units preparing for deployment. The weapon's effectiveness against Japanese fortifications in the Pacific was discovered independently. Marine Corps engineers assaulting fortified islands beginning with Tarawa in November 1943 had encountered pillboxes constructed of concrete, coral, and coconut logs. The fortifications differed in materials from German structures, but presented similar tactical problems. Marine engineers, working without knowledge of the Normandy experience until after-action reports circulated months later, developed nearly identical techniques for using Bangalores against embrasure openings. By 1945, the Bangalore Torpedo had evolved from a specialized wire-cutting tool to a general-purpose demolition weapon. Engineers carried them on virtually every assault operation where fortified positions might be encountered. The weapon saw extensive use during the Siegfried Line fighting in autumn 1944, where German engineers had constructed fortifications even more substantial than those at Normandy. It proved effective against Japanese cave fortifications on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the confined spaces amplified the blast effect. The U.S. Army's Engineer School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, revised its technical manuals to formally incorporate anti-fortification use. Technical Manual 5-25, published in January 1945, devoted an entire chapter to Bangalore torpedo employment against concrete structures. The manual included diagrams showing proper positioning against embrasures, calculations for determining how many sections were needed to reach from covered positions to target openings, and safety procedures specific to fortification assault. What had begun as battlefield improvisation had become formal doctrine within 8 months. The Bangalore Torpedo's effectiveness revealed something more significant than a tactical technique. It exposed a fundamental miscalculation in German defensive strategy. The Atlantic Wall fortifications had been designed assuming that defending forces would face conventional assault methods, naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, infantry advance, and orthodox demolition techniques. German engineers had created structures optimized to resist these expected threats. They had invested enormous resources in concrete, steel, and labor to build fortifications that would withstand predictable attacks. What they had not adequately considered was American operational flexibility. The U.S. military in World War II emphasized decentralized decision-making and encouraged junior leaders to solve problems using whatever means proved effective. This approach contrasted sharply with German military culture, which valued thorough planning and expected adherence to established procedures. German defenders at Normandy fought effectively according to their training and doctrine. American attackers improvised constantly, adapting equipment and techniques to circumstances that doctrine had not anticipated. The fortification problem illustrated this difference perfectly. German engineers had spent years calculating blast resistance and designing structures to defeat known threats. American engineers spent minutes evaluating the tactical situation and recognizing that an available weapon, though designed for a different purpose, might solve the immediate problem. The German approach was more sophisticated from an engineering perspective. The American approach was more effective from an operational perspective. This pattern repeated throughout the European campaign. German forces consistently deployed technically superior equipment, better tanks, better machine guns, better anti-tank weapons. American forces consistently found ways to negate these advantages through superior logistics, tactical flexibility, and operational adaptation. The Bangalore Torpedo story encapsulated this dynamic. The weapon was not superior to German demolitions in any technical sense. It was simply available, familiar to engineers, and adaptable to circumstances that formal doctrine had not addressed. The broader implications extended beyond demolition techniques. The success at Omaha Beach demonstrated that complex problems sometimes yield to simple solutions if those solutions are applied creatively. German fortifications represented sophisticated engineering. They failed not because of design flaws, but because defenders could not anticipate every possible attack method. The embrasures that made the fortifications effective as weapons platforms became vulnerabilities when attackers recognized that focused explosives inserted through those openings could neutralize the positions. Military theorists studying the Normandy campaign in subsequent decades noted that technological superiority does not guarantee tactical success. The Atlantic Wall fortifications were superior to any Allied defensive structures in technical quality. They failed strategically because static defenses, however well constructed, cannot prevent determined attackers from finding vulnerabilities if those attackers have time, resources, and operational flexibility. The Bangalore Torpedo succeeded because American forces possessed all three advantages. The human dimension deserves equal consideration. The engineers who crawled up the Omaha Beach bluffs carrying Bangalore torpedoes were not military theorists contemplating operational flexibility. They were young men, many barely past 20 years old, facing immediate survival problems. They saw fortifications killing their comrades. They recognized that standard techniques were failing. They possessed a tool that might work differently than intended. They made split-second decisions to attempt improvised solutions despite enormous personal risk. This willingness to improvise under fire, to attempt untested techniques when orthodox methods failed, represented something the American military cultivated through training and organizational culture. Engineers were taught basic principles rather than rigid procedures. They learned to evaluate problems and select appropriate tools. They practiced until technical skills became reflexive, freeing mental capacity for tactical problem-solving. When they faced situations their training had not specifically addressed, they possessed both the technical foundation and the psychological permission to improvise. German military culture, by contrast, emphasized thorough preparation and expected adherence to established procedures. This approach produced technically proficient soldiers who executed planned operations effectively. It did not produce soldiers comfortable with improvisation when circumstances deviated from expectations. German defenders at Normandy fought skillfully according to their doctrine. When American attackers employed unexpected techniques, German defenders struggled to adapt because adaptation had not been emphasized in their training. The Bangalore Torpedo remained in American military service long after World War II ended. The weapon saw extensive use in Korea, where North Korean and Chinese forces fortified positions using techniques similar to those employed by Japanese defenders in the Pacific. Engineers in Vietnam employed Bangalores for their original wire-cutting purpose, but also adapted them for clearing vegetation in jungle terrain and breaching earthwork fortifications. The weapon appeared in American inventories through the 1990s, finally being replaced by more sophisticated demolition systems that offered similar capabilities with improved safety. Yet the weapon's longevity was less significant than what its wartime use revealed about military effectiveness. The Bangalore Torpedo succeeded not because it was the best possible tool for fortification assault, but because it was available when needed, familiar to the soldiers who employed it, and adaptable to circumstances its designers had never imagined. These characteristics, availability, familiarity, adaptability, proved more valuable in combat than theoretical superiority of purpose-designed equipment that might not be available at critical moments. Modern military organizations still study the Normandy fortification battles for lessons about improvisation and tactical flexibility. Officer candidates at service academies analyze how engineers adapted existing equipment to solve immediate problems. The case appears in military engineering courses as an example of creative problem-solving under pressure. Infantry officers study how junior leaders made autonomous decisions that collectively enabled the beach's clearance when higher-level planning had broken down. The story also serves as cautionary tale about over-engineered solutions. German fortifications were magnificent from an engineering perspective. They embodied sophisticated understanding of materials, structures, and defensive geometry. They failed because their designers optimized for predicted threats, rather than building in resilience against unexpected attack methods. The lesson resonates beyond military applications. Systems designed to resist specific known threats may prove vulnerable to attacks from unexpected directions using unconventional methods. Staff Sergeant Michael Kurowski returned to civilian life in 1945. He worked as a construction foreman in Pennsylvania, married, raised 4 children, and rarely discussed his wartime service. In a 1987 interview conducted by a local historical society, he reflected on the morning at Omaha Beach. "We weren't thinking about doctrine or tactics," he said. "We were thinking about staying alive and helping the guys next to us stay alive. The Bangalore was just a tool we had. It seemed like it might work. We tried it. It worked. That's all." His matter-of-fact assessment captured something essential about combat effectiveness. Sophisticated analysis, comprehensive planning, and superior technology matter considerably. But in the moment of crisis, when plans have failed and circumstances demand immediate action, the soldiers who succeed are those who recognize problems, identify available resources, and attempt solutions despite incomplete information and enormous risk. The Bangalore Torpedo became an anti-fortification weapon because soldiers like Kurowski made that decision in real time under fire, not because staff officers had analyzed the problem and issued revised doctrine. The fortifications at Omaha Beach still stand, eroding slowly under decades of weathering. Visitors can walk among the concrete structures, examine the embrasures, and contemplate what occurred there on June 6, 1944. The concrete remains impressive. The walls are indeed massive. The engineering is evident. Yet these fortifications, designed to resist invasion, were breached within hours by soldiers carrying a weapon designed 47 years earlier for cutting wire in India. The story that began that morning with Staff Sergeant Kurowski crouching in the surf, watching a pillbox, and calculating whether his Bangalore Torpedo might reach its embrasure, ended with a profound lesson about military effectiveness. Superior engineering matters, but operational flexibility, tactical improvisation, and soldiers willing to attempt untested solutions under desperate circumstances matter more. The concrete fortifications were designed to withstand every anticipated threat. They could not withstand the unanticipated. American engineers who refused to accept that any problem was unsolvable, who possessed tools and the initiative to use them creatively, who were willing to risk everything on an improvised technique that might fail, but seemed worth attempting because orthodox methods had already failed. The Bangalore Torpedo did not win the Battle of Omaha Beach. Thousands of soldiers fighting with rifles, machine guns, and sheer determination won that battle. But the Bangalore provided a crucial capability at critical moments, enabling engineers to reduce fortifications that were stopping the advance. It worked not because it was the perfect tool, but because it was the available tool in the hands of soldiers trained to improvise, permitted to innovate, and desperate enough to try. That remains its legacy. Not as a weapon, but as an example of what becomes possible when competent soldiers possess both the tools and the freedom to solve problems creatively under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.